Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial.
Hi, I'm Drachinifel. They picked me up on the side of a road.
And we're at the Pacific Fleet Submarine Museum here in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, home of USS Bowfin. A very common question I get asked is why don't American cruisers, and to a lesser extent, American battleships or battleships at all during World War II, carry torpedoes if they're such a deadly weapon? So today, Drac and I are going to talk about why that is. Do you want to start off talking about what American cruisers did carry torpedoes?
Basically, the last generation of American cruisers that carry torpedoes are the Omahas, which are the immediate post-World War I designs. Then there's kind of a little bit of a blip, and then you have the American heavy cruisers, Pensacola's, Northamptons, etc. And then that's basically all the American cruisers that are built for almost a decade till the Brooklyns come along, and then the Clevelands, Wichita on our own, the last kind of pre-war heavy cruiser design, and then you get into the Baltimores and so forth. But after the Omahas, although in some of the initial design drawings for the ships that will eventually turn into the Pensacolas, they do have some torpedo launchers, as actually built, and as you go into World War II, the Omahas are the only torpedo-carrying cruisers in the US fleet, with the exception of the Atlantas, which are technically initially not supposed to be cruisers. They're actually technically massive destroyer flotilla leaders, which is actually a good part of why they're equipped with torpedoes. But someone takes a look at them and goes, with that many guns and at that displacement, yeah, they're really cruisers. So they get classified as such.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing in that the Omahas are built with torpedoes. About half of their torpedoes are removed during the war or leading up to the war. The designs that did have torpedoes are removed. How does that compare to European cruisers or Japanese cruisers?
Well, the Japanese have gone pretty much all in with their torpedo armament. They've got multiple sets of launchers, and they're actually adding to them. So a number of Japanese cruiser classes in the interwar period start off with multiple sets of twin launchers, and then they're given triple or quadruple launchers later on in refits. And as with Japanese destroyers, a number of them carry reloads as well. Then in the European theatre, everybody's got torpedoes. The French have torpedoes, the Italians have torpedoes, the Germans have torpedoes, all the British cruisers have torpedoes. The Americans are pretty much the exception in terms of the large fleets, in that their cruisers aren't being built with torpedoes.
Why do you think that is? Like, what is the advantages and disadvantages of torpedoes on cruisers?
So basically, the main thing that a torpedo gives a cruiser is the ability to hurt ships bigger than itself. Because especially in the interwar period, I mean, a 6-inch gun or an 8-inch gun is going to mess up a destroyer pretty badly. One of the reasons that a lot of ships go with a kind of a 6-inch or 6-inch-ish secondary armament is that is considered to be about the smallest shell that you can get that will reliably stop a destroyer with 1 or 2 hits. And so light cruiser with lots of those guns will be able to do quite a number on a destroyer. An 8-inch cruiser, it can't fire quite as rapidly, but it's an 8-inch shell, so one 8-inch shell in a decent location, that'll stop a destroyer. And then against each other, one of the big problems with the treaty era cruisers is that the design requirements are written in terms of displacement are written in the 1920s, the early 1920s, when anti-aircraft armament is minimal. And by the time you get to the main period when the Brooklyns, the Towns, etc. are all being built, it turns out that once you incorporate any kind of torpedo defense at all, and as much anti-aircraft weaponry as you possibly can, you're actually really pushing the limits. And so a lot of cruisers end up being designed as armored against 6-inch guns, maybe. But very, very few can claim any kind of creditable defense against 8-inch guns. So against anything up to and including a heavy cruiser, most cruiser guns are somewhat effective in some way, shape or form. What they're not effective against is battleships. And a torpedo is effective against battleships. It gives you this capability of knocking out battleships, or at least scaring them off. In theory, if you're fighting other cruisers or destroyers, obviously that will have a fairly nice effect on them as well. But really, in the kind of engagement you're likely to be fighting, if you as a cruiser manage to put multiple torpedoes into your opponent cruiser or destroyer without launching, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of them out like the Japanese, you're probably never going to hit anything. If you do hit something, the other side's done something horribly wrong. They can be somewhat useful as a way of distracting the enemy or forcing them to maneuver, like at the Battle of the River Plate, but it's very rare you'll actually score a hit. The percentage hit rates are awful.
Today's video is brought to you by Established Titles. Established Titles uses the ancient Scottish tradition of making landowners a laird or lady, lord or lady, by simple merit of owning property in Scotland. So Established Titles allows you to buy as little as 1 square foot of property in Scotland to become a Scottish lord or lady. This is a prefix like Mr. or Mrs. that you can put on things like your plane tickets, your credit cards, and even your dating profiles. That one's my favorite. They send you a certificate like this one. I'm Lord Ryan Mick now. Established Titles makes a great last-minute gift idea. Remember, the holiday season is approaching. And they donate to One Trees Planted and Trees for the Future. I absolutely love this environmentalism about the company. Remember to use the discount code Battleship to get 10% off your next purchase. And the first 200 people who purchase will get a plot right next to mine in the same kingdom. Established Titles makes a great last-minute gift, and they're running an amazing sale right now in addition to our discount code, so go over there soon. Go to establishedtitles.com/battleship and use the discount code Battleship to get your gifts now and support our channel and our museum. So let's go into battleships. What battleships are carrying torpedoes still during World War II? What types?
So the older ships, World War I era and earlier ships that are still around because of the treaty system, but even they've usually had some of their torpedo launchers removed, in some cases all. Hood, for example, when she goes into the Battle of Denmark Strait, she was originally built with quite a few, but she's down to a couple of launchers per side at that point. And a number of other ships also lose some or all of their torpedo launchers, but there's still a reasonable number that have them. Obviously, famously, the Nelson class have them, so Rodney probably is the only battleship to successfully torpedo another battleship when she hits Bismarck. But anything that's designed battleship-wise post 1920s-ish doesn't have torpedo launchers, at least as originally designed. Tirpitz gets a couple of quad launchers stuck on after the fact, but that's not an original feature of the Bismarck class. Bismarck certainly never had any torpedo launchers.
Schonhurst and Gneisenau too, if I'm not mistaken, get them added on.
Yeah. But basically, what it comes down to, and the reason why they've kind of been eliminated, and why the US Navy eliminates them a lot sooner, because the standard class generally don't have torpedo launchers, whereas the QEs, as Hood, Nelson, they all do, is because in the 1910s and 1920s, every navy has a different idea about what effective battle range is going to be. At the very low end of things, you have the French, who, even as far as the latter part of World War I, are convinced that actually you're going to be fighting at 10 to 12,000 yards. The British are kind of in the middle of the pack, maybe middle to upper third. And then the people who are really convinced in long-range gunnery is the US Navy. And this is kind of where you see why some nations keep torpedo launchers and others don't. Because as far as the British are concerned, especially with some of the heavyweight torpedoes that they develop for the Nelsons, their maximum range, whilst it's a little bit less than what they expect the standard battle range to be, it's not that much less. And because they expect the battle to close down, because that's what it always seems to have done, they reckon that certainly by the mid to latter part of any major battleship engagement, they're going to be in torpedo range, at which point some torpedoes might be handy. Whereas the Americans, even as early as the late 1910s, are thinking of engagements in the 18, 20,000, 20,000 plus range bracket. There's no way a torpedo that's not motoring at about 10 knots is ever going to reach that far as they're concerned. And apart from the long ones, they're pretty much right. And as far as they can tell, the battle range is only ever going to increase. And if, in the American view, if you're starting your engagement at, say, 25,000 yards, if you've managed to fight your way down and down and down and down, and you've got down to 12, 15,000 yards where maybe a torpedo at long range might be somewhat useful, you've already done it horribly, horribly wrong. It's like there is no reason the battle should be fought at that close range as far as they're concerned. outside of exceptional circumstances, at which point, why have torpedoes? The other thing is that having a torpedo launcher aboard your ship is a big risk when it comes to battleships. So if you have an external launcher like Tirpitz does, it means that, okay, if it gets hit, the explosion is probably not going to cripple the ship, but it is more likely to be hit and knocked out or explode in the first place because it's exposed. Whereas if you have what most battleships have, which are internal torpedo launchers, mostly below the waterline, they're fairly well protected. They're relatively unlikely to be hit. But one of the big lessons that actually comes out of World War One is that because what they call the torpedo flat has to be so big, because you've got to have the handling area for the torpedo, you've got to have multiple torpedoes plus the launcher itself, etc., etc. It's a hugely vulnerable spot. When you consider, say, the German battle cruisers at Jutland, Lutzow sinks pretty much because she takes a hit that punctures the forward torpedo flat at such a big volume that once it floods, that ship's going down pretty much no matter what they can do about it. Whereas Seydlitz is almost the exact opposite. Everything forward in Seydlitz floods except the torpedo flat, which basically acts as a big life preserver, which just about keeps it afloat long enough for it to not sink, or kind of not sink, but anyway, gets home. But then in the aftermath, everyone, especially after World War One, people are looking at this and considering, okay, so this thing could be the make or break, and if something goes wrong, it's the break. That's a big risk. Is that risk potentially mitigated by the benefits? And if you believe that gunnery is going to happen at very close ranges, possibly yes, especially because also at closer ranges, with the shells coming in more horizontal, they're less likely to get deep enough to penetrate the torpedo flat. Whereas if you're thinking like an American admiral, and you're thinking, right, long range, well, the torpedo's not going to be any use because we can't hit anything, and at long range, plunging fire is more likely to get down deep into the ship and potentially cause flooding there, it then becomes much less of a useful thing to have aboard, and therefore it gets eliminated. And of course, once you eliminate a big area like that, you've got displacement and volume to use for other things like fuel, because you need to go long distances if you're in the Pacific.
So do you think Wartime Experience justifies the American view or not?
I think overall, the American view of torpedoes on battleships is certainly justified. I mean, the reason Bismarck being hit by Rodney is so famous is because it is the only circumstance that happens in.
And Bismarck's practically dead still.
Yeah, she's dead in the water, and it's one of these things of, it's a nice thing to have done for the Rodney, but it doesn't manifestly affect what's going to happen to Bismarck. There are a few other battleship engagements where, in theory, they were within torpedo range, like Washington versus Hiroshima. But again, whether or not Washington was armed with torpedoes was not going to change the fate of Hiroshima in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, I think overall, the American view on whether or not you should have a torpedo on battleship in World War II was certainly justified by events. The flip side of the cruisers is a little bit more questionable, because a lot of cruisers do end up fighting at fairly close range with each other. The Japanese, to an extent, have success with their torpedo-armed cruisers, certainly early in the war, although how much of that is dump 120 torpedoes into the water, something's going to get hit, is open to question. But then on the flip side is, that many torpedoes, especially powered by compressed oxygen on deck, doesn't really help them later on once they actually start getting counterattacked. And there's also a lot of cruisers exchanging torpedo fire with each other and with various other targets in European and Mediterranean waters. So it's kind of, I think you kind of argue 6 of one, half dozen of the other. The great imponderable, of course, is that if you've got 8, 10, 12 torpedo launchers, plus torpedoes, plus the guidance equipment, plus the men, plus the volume taken up, what could you have had instead? And when, for example, you have Operation Torch, you've got French cruisers and destroyers out there with lots of torpedoes versus a fleet that's basically American, and their cruisers don't have torpedoes, but the American cruisers come off the winners in that case, primarily through the use of long-range 6 and 8-inch gunfire, which is what they've stuck on their ships instead. So I think there's a bit more of a circumstantial argument to be had with the cruisers, but in some engagements, the Americans managed to prove their point that having just superior firepower and protection can be made to work. In some other engagements, potentially it's the other way around. Certainly some of the earlier night engagements around Guadalcanal, the fact that the Japanese cruisers are spamming torpedoes really does help them.
For sure.
But in some ways, it actually does validate, to a certain degree, the American view of where the battle should take place, because where almost any engagement where cruiser torpedoes come into play is a close range engagement. The American doctrine isn't to fight at close range engagements, to fight at longer ranges, and when cruisers do fight at longer ranges, suddenly you actually see the torpedo use drops off quite dramatically.
So we've been talking a lot about cruiser and battleship torpedoes. Did you know that there is one aircraft carrier that was built with torpedo launchers? If you can remember the name of that carrier, let us know in the comment section down below. Also, if you like the collaborations that we're doing, let us know in the comment section down below. You like it, you don't like it, who you'd like to see us collaborate with in the future. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below for ways you can support us. Since we're filming at the Pacific Fleet Submarine Museum, home of USS Bowfin today, we've dropped a link down there for them. You should consider supporting their operations out here in Pearl Harbor. You can support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our channel and our museum. Also, be sure to go and check out the 5-Minute Warship Guide channel hosted by Drachinifel here, which is also linked in the description below. Thanks for watching.